My son walked into my kitchen on a Tuesday morning carrying a manila folder and a pen he'd already uncapped. He set both down on the table like he owned it. And I thought, as I watched him pull out the chair across from me, not the one he usually sits in, the one to my left, but the one directly across, I thought he practiced this. Have you ever watched someone walk into a room and known just from the way they moved that something was already decided in their head? I'm Lindsay Hill, 73 years old, retired civil engineer, 31 years, designing infrastructure across 3 states. I managed budgets in the tens of millions. I read contracts the way most people read menus, looking for what's missing, not just what's there. My husband Gerald died 4 years ago. Cardiac event, no warning, a Tuesday just like that one. The grief was enormous, still is some days. But grief didn't make me slow. If anything, losing Gerald made me pay attention to everything in a way I hadn't since I was young, and first learning how the world actually worked. My son Richard is 46, commercial real estate. He was always ambitious. Gerald used to balance that out, pull him back when his reach got too close to other people's lives. After Gerald was gone, there was nothing left to balance him. Here's what I want to ask you, and I want you to actually think about this. When someone who loves you starts asking questions that feel a little off, not wrong, exactly just angled, how long does it take you to trust that feeling? It started with phone calls. Every single day. I was touched at first, my son checking in. Then I started noticing the calls had a pattern. He'd ask how I was feeling, how I was sleeping, and then always something about the finances. Which accounts was I using? Whether I'd talked to Claire, my financial advisor, whether I'd thought about updating my will, casual, conversational, the way you ask about the weather. I have a coffee mug Gerald bought me at a gas station in Nevada in 1987. It says, "World's Okayest Engineer" on it. I was holding that mug during one of those calls, standing at the kitchen window, watching 2 squirrels argue over something in the yard, and I remember thinking he's not asking because he's worried. He's asking because he's keeping track. I didn't say that out loud. I just kept watching the squirrels. Then came what he called suggestions. The investment properties were a burden for a woman my age. The trust Gerald and I had set up should be restructured tax purposes, he said. Claire was too old-fashioned. He had a man he wanted me to meet, younger, specialized in senior asset management. I declined. He asked again the following week, same words, slightly different order. What was going through your mind as you heard all that? Because I'll tell you, I wasn't panicking. I was filing. Every word of it, somewhere in the back of my head, just filed. The real moment came 8 months after Gerald's funeral. I was at my daughter Patricia's apartment, sitting at her kitchen table drinking tea that had gone cold when she slid a document across to me and said she thought she might be misunderstanding something. She wasn't. It was a pre-agreement. Voluntary restructuring, it called itself. It would have moved the trust, both investment properties and the management rights to my home, into a family holding entity. Richard would be the sole administrative trustee. Patricia would receive annual distributions as determined by the trustee. And me, I was listed as a beneficiary of my own estate. There it is. I folded the paper, slid it back into the envelope, told Patricia I needed some air, walked around the block twice, not to calm down. I was already calm, but to let myself feel the full size of what I was looking at before I decided what to do about it. When I came back inside, I told her we are not going to confront him. Not yet. We are going to be very careful. Patricia, to her credit, didn't argue. She just nodded and refilled my tea. What would you have done in that moment? Gone straight at him or taken a breath and thought it through? That evening, I called Dorothy Haynes. We'd been friends since our kids were small, gone to the same school, same awkward holiday concerts, same bleachers at Saturday games. Dorothy had spent her career in probate and elder law. I'd been to her retirement party. I also knew she still took private cases. I asked if she'd take mine. She didn't hesitate for a second. Over the next several weeks, Dorothy and I worked through everything. Gerald's will, the trust documents, every financial record I'd kept since he died, and I kept good one's habit from 30 years of project management. What she found was troubling, but not yet illegal. Richard had contacted Claire directly, presenting himself as a family representative. Claire had refused to share anything without my written consent and had flagged the contact in an email I'd almost missed in my inbox. I called Claire that night. She picked up on the second ring and said she'd been hoping I'd call. Then Dorothy found the signature. On a document filed with the county recorder's office 7 months earlier, a limited power of attorney granting Richard authority to act on my behalf in real estate matters. My name, my supposed signature, a real notary stamp. I had never signed that document. I had never seen it. Dorothy looked at me across her desk with the expression of someone who's seen bad things and knows what they are. She said, "Lindsay, this is no longer a family disagreement. This is fraud." I drove home, sat in the kitchen, looked at Gerald's photograph on the shelf. I still talk to him. I'm not embarrassed about that, and I told him what was happening. Then I made a list. When Dorothy showed you that forged signature, what do you think went through Lindsay's mind? First anger, or something colder than that? I hired a forensic document examiner. Dorothy filed a quiet complaint with the county recorder to flag the document. I started logging every conversation with Richard audio, saved automatically to a cloud account he had no access to. And I brought Patricia fully into the plan because I needed her to keep behaving normally around her brother while we worked. That part was hard on her. I know it was. The 11 months of waiting had a particular texture to them that I still find difficult to describe. Every Sunday dinner where Richard passed the bread basket and asked if I'd thought any more about simplifying things. Every time Sandra touched my arm and said I seemed tired, did I need help with anything? I would smile and say no, and mean nothing by the smile at all. I was somewhere else entirely, running through documents in my head, checking off steps, keeping the list current. There were nights I sat at this table with a glass of water and just thought about the notary stamp. Someone had pressed that stamp onto a document with my forged name on it and handed it to a government office. Someone had done that as a routine part of their Tuesday. I don't know if that person knew exactly what they were participating in. They were never charged. I still think about them sometimes, the way you think about a detail that never quite resolves. Richard kept calling. He kept pushing. His wife, Sandra, started appearing in the conversations more. She'd always had this way of being sweet that felt less like warmth and more like a hand on your shoulder steering you somewhere. She started mentioning my forgetfulness, small things I supposedly said and then denied. She did it in the softest possible voice, full of concern. I understood exactly what she was doing. The text messages recovered later showed Sandra coaching Richard on which incidents to mention, what language to use, how to frame things. She'd sat at my dinner table with a script. So, when Richard finally walked through my door that Tuesday morning with his uncapped pen and his manila folder, he'd been building toward it for 11 months. He sat across from me, that chair, the deliberate one, and explained that this was the next logical step, that I would be protected, that the properties were too much for me to manage alone, that he only wanted what was best. He said it all very smoothly. He'd practiced, like I said. I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought about the time he was 9 and broke his arm falling out of the oak tree in the backyard and screamed my name, not Gerald's, mine. I thought about that. It didn't change anything, but I thought about it. Then I said, "Richard, step outside for just a moment. There's someone here to see us both." His face shifted. And then Dorothy walked through the front door, followed by a detective from the County Fraud Unit and a representative from the State Attorney General's Elder Affairs Division. The color left his face like someone had pulled a plug. What do you think Richard expected to see on Lindsay's face in that moment? And what did he find instead? Dorothy placed a folder on the table beside his unsigned document. She spoke the way she's always spoken, quietly and without drama. She explained that the forged power of attorney was under active investigation. She laid out the documented contacts with my financial advisor. She presented records of 3 separate attempts Richard had made to access accounts he had no legal standing to touch. She told him in the gentlest professional voice you've ever heard that he had a narrow window in which cooperating fully would be the wisest decision he could make. Richard left with the detective for an interview that lasted 4 hours. The legal process that followed had the feel of something that had been set in motion a long time ago and was now just arriving. Richard was charged with elder financial fraud and document forgery. The paralegal at his real estate firm who'd helped with the mechanics was charged separately. Sandra, who'd known from early on, was charged as a co-conspirator, 18 months and a substantial fine. Patricia testified. She sat in that witness chair in a gray blazer she'd bought specifically for the occasion. I noticed that the new blazer and it broke something open in my chest a little. She cried twice. The second time was when the prosecutor read aloud from the document Richard had originally sent her, the one she'd handed me across her kitchen table. She hadn't known when she handed it to me that she was handing me the beginning of all of this. She gathered herself both times and kept going. That took more courage than anything I did, I think. I had the plan. She had to stand up there with no armor. The judge was a woman named Carolyn Marsh. She told Richard directly that what he'd done wasn't a gray area, wasn't a family dispute the courts were reluctant to touch. She called it predation. Richard received 30 months in federal custody restitution and 5 years supervised release. I was there for both sentencings. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. Not triumph. Something more like the end of a very long physical effort, the feeling in your arms after you've been carrying something heavy and finally set it down. If you'd been sitting in that courtroom, what do you think you would have felt watching all of it unfold? In the weeks after I sat with it, the grief of it, I mean not the legal outcome, that part was done, but the fact of my son looking at me and seeing a problem to be managed, an asset to be moved around. That truth didn't stop hurting just because I'd handled it well. I let myself feel it. The same way I'd learned to feel grief after Gerald, not by pushing it away, but by sitting with it until it became part of the story instead of the whole story. Richard wrote to me from the federal facility. Long letter, mostly about himself. Near the end, he said he hoped I understood he'd only been trying to look after me, that his intentions were good. I read every word of it the way I read everything. Then I put it in a folder labeled R in my filing cabinet between a property tax assessment and a receipt for roof repairs. Not out of anger. It was just a document. These days, I volunteer twice a week with a coalition. Dorothy connected me to elder law attorneys working to help older adults understand their legal rights and read the documents that get put in front of them. I spent 31 years reading contracts. Turns out that's useful in a room full of people who've been handed something confusing and told to trust it. I'm still talking to Gerald every evening, not out of sadness anymore, just habit and love, and the feeling that a conversation that long doesn't stop just because one person leaves the room. Here is what I want to leave you with. Quiet is not the same as confused. Patient is not the same as passive. The person who seems to simply go along with things may be doing so because they are watching everything very closely and have already decided what comes next. Gerald used to say, the most underestimated force in any situation is a patient person who has already made up their mind. I think about that a lot these days. Have you ever had to stay quiet and wait, even when every instinct told you to act immediately? And in the end, did the patience pay off? Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let someone believe they've already won.